Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining today. I'm Eleanor, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and welcome to the 663rd New Social Environment. I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Daniel Fernández Pascual and Alon Schwabe of Cooking Sections and Izabella Scott, who will be hosting the conversation today. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Britt here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual and necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Established in London in 2013 by Daniel Fernández Pascual and Alon Schwabe, Cooking Sections examines the systems that organize the world through food. Using site-responsive installation, performance, and video, they explore the overlapping boundaries between art, architecture, ecology, and geopolitics. They've worked on multiple iterations of the long-term site-responsive CLIMAVORE project since 2015. They are part of British Art Show 9, lead a studio at the Royal College of Art, London, and were guest professors at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. Among other awards, Cooking Sections were nominated for the Turner Prize in 2021. And our host today, writer, editor, and researcher Izabella Scott, is based in London. She works as editor at The White Review. Her essays and criticisms have appeared in Art Review, The Financial Times, and Art Forum, among many other publications. And she is currently undertaking a PhD on gender identity and the law at Queen Mary University of London. We're so excited to have them here today to talk about the amazing work of Cooking Sections, and I'm excited to pass it over to you, Izabella, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. It's really great to be here, and thank you all for joining us. I'm delighted to be here with Alon and Daniel of Cooking Sections, and as introduced, I'm Izabella and based in London. And we're here to talk about Cooking Sections' body of work from their new installation, Undamming Rivers, which is currently on show in Sweden, to the Salmon Trilogy, which is soon to be exhibited at the Fisher Centre at Bard. I think that opens next week for anyone who can make it up there. And I want to start with a question about colour. So your Salmon Trilogy is called, for the first time, The When, salmon, 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 in various square brackets. And here's an image, I think it's come up on the screen. And this trilogy and your work more generally thinks about colour and what it can tell us about the environment and about environmental changes. And the first in the trilogy is called Salmon, a Red Herring. And it's a diorama. I saw it at Tate Britain in London, which is a sort of diorama of animals with a light display and an audio essay. And the installation is a critique of the industrial capture of salmon pink. So my first question is really about this industrial capture and about salmon. I'd love you both to tell me about this work. I guess your research into how salmon is produced by corporate aqua giants and this inconvenient fact, which the work is really based around. This inconvenient fact that the aquaculture giants had to face, that the salmon that they were producing in farms, in these giant farms, were no longer pink.
Great. Thank you so much, Izabella, and thank you, everyone, for being here with us and for the Brooklyn Rail to invite us this evening. And yeah, I mean, I think for us, color really kind of played a very important role kind of in how we started thinking about salmon and why we started thinking about salmon. So we were invited back in 2016 to do a project on the Isle of Skye, which is an island off the west coast of Scotland. And it's an island that in the past couple of decades has kind of, from being a home for 10,000 residents, it also became a home for more than 16 million farmed fish. And in this kind of transformation that happens to the environment there, I think one of the things that kind of sparked the whole project, that we spoke to two biologists that have been kind of studying the changes in the environments. And one of the first stories they told us when we met in Skye, that people have spotted a sparrow that had turned pink. And we were like, this is like, and before you showed the image, we were like, this is like, sounds very suspicious. I mean, this is a beautiful story, right? And this is, but like, can like
urban legend.
Yeah, you know, like this is, can like a sparrow turn salmon? And funnily enough, a year later, someone like caught this sparrow or a similar sparrow on film outside of Glasgow. And what has been happening is basically that scavenger kind of birds have been eating feed pellets off salmon farms, and basically taking on the colors of salmon. So this is
our dear friend, the salmon sparrow. And that was, I think, like in 2016 when we came across that story. And basically that led to this whole investigation into color, but also not just color as the species color, but also as an industrial process that allows us to identify red flags in the environment, meaning indicators of crisis, or why do salmon need to be fed artificial color? Why do birds turn pink after eating feed pellets from a salmon farm, etc., etc.? And that also, in a way, leads to many brackets that we love to use to basically cope with these impossibility of understanding what a species is today in a post-industrial world, when we start kind of mixing what salmon as a fish is, or salmon as a color is, who defines it, and how is it all politically or industrially constructed.
And basically this salmon and red herring is really kind of tries to understand this process, or what happened kind of in the process of like industrialization of color, and the fact that many species are kind of today moving constantly. And this is also true to us humans, right? We have kind of, but our species has polluted, you know, or has painted the world to such an extent that it's not so much kind of that we are kind of, you know, that color is moving through us, or that we are moving kind of through, but like that pollution is kind of moving through us, but it's like we who are constantly moving through color and through pollution. And I talk about we as kind of all of these like species that are affected by industrialized processes. And really kind of through a series of like 14 species in this installation, from flamingos in zoos that have to be fed artificial pigments in order to acquire the flamingo color that visitors to the zoo expect, to dogs in India that live near textile factories, basically, that are dumping all of the, you know, the color of like the must-wear color of every season are being dumped into the rivers. And then kind of these dogs acquire they become like must-wear colored dogs, and so on and so forth. We are kind of trying to understand what it means to the, you know, that we live in an era not only that the atmosphere is polluted, but what we kind of talk about is the chromatmosphere. So how kind of the climate crisis can be seen in kind of the colors of the atmosphere, in a sense, and the fact that these colors are what is kind of also changing, and our perception of color is changing through that.
That was a wonderful answer, thank you. And I love the way you describe these things as red flags, you know, these visual cues that we can begin to understand this impact on the environment and these traces of industrialization and climate change, which is often, I guess, one of the issues is it can be in some places so incremental, it can be difficult to see, it can be difficult to quantify and land upon. So describing them as red flags is really lovely. In the you described the diorama so well with all these different animals, and they're white, and there's a light show that puts colors onto the animal, so it becomes a kind of metaphor. But just to turn back to this idea of the kind of salmon and their color specifically, because there's many other implications of all these other changes in the environment, but that sparrow, as you described so well, brought you to looking specifically at salmon farming. And I guess what's happened is, as fish are kept in these giant metal nets in Scotland and Norway, in various places in Sweden, they've lost their color, and color is really a story. And so before we turn to the way that the color is kind of hacked and reintroduced, just kind of wanted to ask you about the color that the salmon, what's the story that the color salmon tells, when like the question of why these fish are pink and what we can learn from that color pigmentation that's naturally occurring in wild salmon.
Mm-hmm. It's quite fascinating, and we, at least for us, we got quite hooked into understanding all these kind of processes whereby color flows
and is absorbed. Yeah. And
the basic story, in kind of simple terms, is that basically salmon are special because they are an anadromous fish, which means that they are born upstream. Then they start growing like down the river, then they go to the sea, and then there they start feeding on many basically krill and crustaceans, little shrimp, that give them this characteristic salmon color. And because they need to go back up to the same place where they were born to spawn, they need a lot of energy. So they are at sea, very happy, eating a lot of krill and shrimp. And the more they eat, the pinker also they get. And then they start the journey, when they are ready to mate, they start their journey back upstream against the current, which not many animals in nature do, to go, like basically this flow of marine nutrients, incredible amount of marine nutrients that go up the river to the place where they remember that they were born and then spawn again. And with that, they carry the color, which is a compound called astaxanthin, that in principle in farms, if they were fed krill and shrimp, then the fish would also become, or salmon would become salmon, or the salmon we expect from them. But the problem is that krill and shrimp are expensive. So farms rather give them something cheaper and add the color as an artificial pigment from a lab, astaxanthin from the lab. And then is when this whole industrial color process starts creating trouble, because it's very hard for the animal to calculate or estimate how much color they would acquire in their flesh. And obviously you want to, as a business, you want to put the least amount of color, but you also want the most efficient color for people to match their consumer expectations of how salmon should salmon. And this is when we play a lot with the brackets, because salmon is a noun, is an adjective, is a color, is a verb, it's a process. And this is when the brackets become very useful also in the book that we published, to understand what is color, what is a species, what is all mixed together, and try to imagine or reimagine how this color moves through different bodies.
Yeah, so sorry, I was just
Yeah.
humming in agreement. Yeah.
And that is when we started looking into how these salmon color moves, but also all the species that are involved in that digestive or metabolic process.
And yeah, and I think also to connect it, and maybe I'm already jumping to your next question or like prepping it, but I think like one of the interesting things here, and like I hope everyone can follow like a bit more of like sciencey stuff, but basically what happens, because astaxanthin is an antioxidant, so basically it's kind of, when it is absorbed by the fish, it's a way for them to kind of protect their flesh, because they're under immense amount of stress. And it's very true that like, especially in the Pacific coast of North America, a lot of like when the Pacific salmon kind of swim upstream, many of them, they push the color like outside, right? And they turn like much more salmon color because they're exerting so much of this kind of energy and so much of the stress. But what also happens in farms is because the fish, you know, we're talking about each one of these pens hosting between 1 to 2 million fish in them, right, that are grown in like extremely close proximity and under a lot of stress. It's also very hard for this kind of salmon, like farm salmon body, to hold the color in its flesh, right? And
to salmon.
So there's like all of this kind of a constant mismatch in a way in the farm between what the consumer expects and what kind of the salmon or kind of, I don't know if we can even call it salmon, but this kind of species, farm species, what they can actually kind of produce or kind of absorb or kind of bring to the table.
Yeah, that's such a lovely answer. And I mean, it's amazing how kind of deep into the science you went to really understand this and the metabolic process within the fish, but also this idea that the color has a meaning. It's not arbitrary. This color, which has got antioxidant, which protects them. And I guess the thing with industrial farming is it tries to control these things. And to some extent, you know, salmon, as you say in your audio essay, these salmon are constructed. These farm salmon are no longer salmon. And your wordplay is beautiful because, as you said, there's the color and there's the species, and they begin to blur as it kind of loses its meaning because it's so artificial. But this sense that, you know, as much control there is, there's also this kind of gap between what's possible with this kind of also an artificial yet organic creature. And yeah, this is a picture of your wonderful published text of the audio essay, which is really wonderful to read as well. It's very rich and dense. Your descriptions in the essay of salmon farming are really vivid and disturbing to hear of the, you know, millions of fish in these metal nets and the intensity and the kind of lice they have, and the conditions are kind of terrible. And it's also fascinating, I guess we've talked about these pellets. So the fish are fed with pellets with coloring in order to make them pink, because they're not eating the krill, they're no longer pink, they're completely gray, and consumers want their salmon to be pink. They want to recognize this consumer product. And there's a Dutch company, which you talk about in your essay, that produces this thing called the Samofan. And I think we got a picture of it somewhere. And I was so struck when I saw it. It's 15 shades of pink that you can choose from your pellets. So I think people might recognize it from the supermarkets. You sometimes see very, very vivid sort of blood red salmon, and other times salmon that's a lot paler. And this idea that it's a kind of process where a, you know, aquaculture giant will choose this specific color. And as you mentioned, there's also a Yoko fan out there that does the same thing with battery chickens. And I guess seeing this fan, for me, it was such a kind of vivid way to understand the manufactured process, this way in which color is being produced and controlled, and it's also slipping out of control. And it would be wonderful to hear about in the installation. There's this beautiful way in which you bring the colors of the Samofan into these kind of white diorama to kind of show the way in which this color is bleeding and manufactured onto this environment. And of course, the diorama is a kind of death scene. Historically, there's a taxidermy element. So you have this kind of white, deathy scene. I think there's a GIF even coming up. But I'd love to hear about that kind of influence of the Samofan onto the work and what you try and visualize.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe also for a bit of background, we were fascinated with the diorama in itself, as you were saying, this display of death with usually taxidermied animals, with the whole colonial history of display of, but also displays species, right? And then we learned about the next generation of dioramas, if you want, that are called cycloramas, which then have also these curved corners for the calibration of light. And that's what is literally used to calibrate what the human eye sees. And we thought that it was very much into this idea of the chromatmosphere as we wanted to explore it. So that's kind of the set. of sorts in the installation that was first at Tate Britain. And then there we put all these animals that are exposed to the different salmon pantones of the Samophane. So on the one hand, each one has its story of, as we were saying, like the sparrow, the salmon, the flamingo, that flamingo's flamingo, the woodpeckers that now are changing color because of invasive berries, etc., etc. There are many stories also in the book. But what was interesting for us is these 15 very iconic tones or shades of salmon that the industry uses to match your color expectations.
And in that sense, it's kind of really, we talk about this idea of pantones, right? Or like how the industry uses these kind of 15 different pantones to salmon, the industrialized salmon, and how basically it also changes according to the geography. So salmon in, like, again, in the Pacific coast of North America would be kind of, there's an expectation, because the Pacific salmon is has a much deeper red naturally, or a much deeper salmon color. There, they would, for the consumers, they would try to match that the same way in Japan, where like in Europe, for instance, we're accustomed to more kind of pale looking fish, and the industry is kind of trying to match these expectations, right, by kind of feeding the amount of, or correlating the amount of astaxanthin they're feeding to the different fish. And then basically we kind of, when we started working on this installation, we did like a quite extensive like research process about all of these like colored species. And there are many kind of others because they didn't fall into the salmon palette, or they didn't make it into the installation. But in the book, we talk about like other examples, for instance, with like the peppered moth in the UK, which is kind of when basically there was a new species that emerged because it was kind of better, camouflaged during the Industrial Revolution, where basically all of the buildings in Manchester and London were covered with black like fumes, basically from like all of the factories, and other examples basically that show how this phenomena is like much larger. But here basically we use salmon as kind of the thread, and I think also what is really interesting, as you were saying earlier, Isabel, that it's quite a unique species in the fact that it's one of the latest animals to have been industrialized on such kind of a scale, or domesticated on such a scale. And in that sense, kind of we can really see kind of the moments of like where humans have like controlled that, or kind of bred it to such an extent that it kind of functions in a certain way that kind of provide profit, create a certain image or a certain kind of desired object. And in other places where these kind of animal is still full of leaks, right? There are all of these like the colors that could not be absorbed, the seals, the sparrows that kind of consume the feed pellets that kind of billow out from the salmon farms and are turning salmon too, and so on and so forth. Where I think perhaps with like cattle or like pigs, that the domestication process has gone through, like thousands of years, and it's kind of something that like evolved together with humans. It's a bit more hard to kind of perhaps observe, like this kind of rapid kind of and radical transformation to a species.
Yeah, that's such a great way to describe it, the kind of accelerated, very contemporary mass farming as salmon's got so popular. And I mean, I was speaking to someone recently who was doing their research into the same area, and he said that like the salmon farmers talk about it as the Ferrari of the farming industry, as in it's like they think of it so high tech and flashy and modern, but it's kind of glitching, like a salmon is not a fully industrialized kind of mechanized creature. It's a living creature, and this kind of glitching high tech sort of area. It's true, there's much more to see. There's some kind of way that this can be registered by the human eye. And you put it so well in the audio piece, this idea of chromatic shifts in nature, and this beautiful poetry you use. It's very arresting. You say the world's colors are shifting and the world's colors are moving. which is really kind of, really helps us to sort of absorb it as something tangible that we could really recognize with our eyes. You mentioned a moment ago that there are lots of stories in that essay, and more widely, you just mentioned the moth. There's one I loved just because it's sort of quite local to my experience about pink feather flamingo syndrome, where flamingos in parks, so there's it's called pink feather flamingo syndrome, and it's swans that are fed on moldy bread in parks, and they kind of turn pink because of the bread mold. But there's one that's maybe a bit more local to this audience that I wanted to ask you about, which is in the essay, which is to do with Brooklyn bees. You talk of a summer in 2010 that was very hot, and bees started feeding on something other than flowers. And it's, yes, a kind of anecdote that would be wonderful to hear.
So yeah, so this is another story that when we read about it, we were like, oh my, it's like, so basically in 2010, there was a very hot summer in New York, and which was basically a drought, and a lot of like flowers basically died, and bees like didn't have like flowers to resort for their food. So they kind of resorted to what was available, and one of the things that was available was this like waste candy from a maraschino like cherry factory, like candied cherry factory, and basically they were eating like all of this syrup that is kind of colored with this E314, I think, which is like a petrochemical like based food coloring, and basically they metabolized the color of the syrup, and the color metabolized the hive, right? And you basically see, and if we go to the image before, you can see, and this is like basically happened just with like an urban beekeeper in Brooklyn, that is like his hive turns like maraschino kind of E314 like petrochemical colorant. If we can go Eleanor, if we can go to the image before, I think there's, yeah.
Wow, God, it looks so gory, doesn't it? Kind of a glitchy gore to it. Wow. Thank you for sharing that anecdote.
It is for us like also a sparrow, right? This is how we, as when you were saying before, also is this kind of idea of the colors of the world are shifting, right? And also what we claim is that we need new ways to see them, right? So there is red, it's obvious, it's a red, but what does that red tell us? In the same way that the pink in the feathers of the sparrow was also telling us a story about industrialization of a fish species. What does these red honey tell us about droughts, but also the production of food or non-food in the city? And how do we use these colors as clues or traces to understand how, as we were saying before, it's not just substances flowing through us, but our bodies flowing through substances, which is very much indebted to Hannah Landecker, with whom we've been in conversation for a long time about this idea of metabolism and how these pollutants are metabolizing us.
And in that sense, I think it's very much, the work that we develop also through CLIMAVORE is very much kind of based on this idea that we are living in a time of like rapid environmental transformation, and the way we see the world, the way we sense the world, and the way we kind of talk about the world, and the way we organize the world has to change together with the way climate and the environment is changing. And this is like, we exactly came up with kind of this idea, or in the word CLIMAVORE, to try to understand like how we eat, as the seasons that we kind of all grew up on, right, do not exist anymore. And we need like new seasons according to which we can organize our life, organize our food infrastructure, organize our diets. And as much, and like we really kind of admire and support people that are trying to grow, like this like hyper seasonal and kind of hyper local foods, etc. But that is kind of something, it's almost something that belongs to like a world that does not exist. And at the same time, we need to kind of think while keeping this kind of radical seasonality and locality, understand also like how will it operate like in the decades to come, and how do we kind of change our habits according to that?
Thank you for that answer. I think that even the phrase CLIMAVORE, but what it aims for is really radical and important, that idea of re-envisioning the seasons. And as you were talking, I was thinking even this idea of finding this new semiotics to talk about the environment around us, that the language we have is becoming obsolete. So to update the language, to update our relationship with that environment and what we eat. And it's wonderful to see your CLIMAVORE menus. For those who don't know, these very seasonal, local climate. I mean, there's even the words I'm using don't feel kind of accurate given what I said, but that come up around your exhibitions, which are really beautiful pieces to see. I wanted to turn to your new body of work, which is currently on show in Sweden, Undamming Rivers. So your salmon trilogy is on show, but also this new work called Undamming Rivers, which is to do with this kind of infrastructure, this old infrastructure of concrete dams, on hundreds of concrete dams, which are in many rivers in Sweden. And, the project takes as its starting point these dams built by energy companies, many of which have become obsolete and which have huge environmental impacts. And I'd love you to tell me about your research into these dams and their relationship, I guess, to salmon quite specifically, the way they block the runs. You spoke beautifully about the journey of the salmon upriver. So the relationship of these dams to that journey would be really wonderful to hear.
Yeah. Maybe we can start with the equivalent or parallel story to the sparrow relation to the dams. The way when we were invited by Bonniers Konsthall in Stockholm to develop a new exhibition and project. So as we said, we are showing the trilogy, the salmon trilogy, but also we wanted a fourth episode to respond to understand also the context here. And what we started looking into was the relationship between trees and salmon, right? Well, we were saying that the salmon go upstream. Also, there's been a lot of research around the moment when they die after spawning, decay, and then those marine nutrients that they've carried from very far away upstream are absorbed by trees on the riverbanks, and that's an incredible kind of fertilizer of sorts. So also that how the trees are metabolizing the fish even after being dead. So we wanted to learn more about those interactions. And then we realized after talking to different people that actually the fish don't manage to arrive to the spawning grounds precisely because of all these barriers of modernity that in the post-World War II were considered as the most sustainable green energy, as opposed to coal or later on also nuclear. So there's this kind of situation where you have all these renewable hydropower dams scattered all over the country, not only hundreds, almost thousands of them, but at the same time they are like blocking all these rivers, which is also affecting salmon populations, not only, but many. And then when we started looking into them also and talking to different people in Sápmi, that is like, it's like around like today's Finland, Norway, and Sweden, indigenous territory. Most of these facilities are also in their territory, which is kind of connecting to the whole settler colonial project. But all the electricity is also going mainly to the south of the country, mainly to the big cities or industries. So there was this whole kind of process that's in the same way that we've been working a lot with restaurants and their menus to remove farmed salmon from the table. Also, we started to think, what would it take to actually remove infrastructure or obsolete pieces of concrete that are not only blocking, but also not even producing energy in many cases because the technology is outdated, is from the 50s or the 60s. So then the whole project of Undamming Rivers began almost as a call for action, right? We have all these kind of horrible stories about color and the disappearance of salmon, but also what can we do to start addressing that, apart from bringing salmon farms to an end. Also, how do we deal with all these leftovers of industrial histories?
Yeah, thank you for that answer. It's really wonderful how this detailed research you do, and I know you spent many months and years speaking to specialists and experts and trying to understand this system and bringing together kind of art and activism, because the project becomes about removing these obstacles. I guess the word undamming, this beautiful word of what it means to decommission these dams, what it might mean to remove them. And in this map that's somewhere here, which is at the exhibition, this map that kind of shows all the dams and the different states they're in, and the successes where there's dams that have been granted removal and others that are pending these applications. So the project becomes this very kind of grounded, specific work of removing this obsolete infrastructure to kind of take them out of the environment. What would that look like to kind of, remove them? And I guess I wanted to ask about that process when art becomes activism. What does that work look like? What are those relationships? How does that kind of way that there's the kind of a visual aspect I want to ask about you in a minute, about land art and how you make something visual, but also how you keep the activism strand, how that fits into your practice and really what that looks like.
Yeah, I think it's a great question that I think is a big part, in a sense of of our practice, or trying to figure out, I think these are one of the big questions that is driving our practice. And I think in very concrete terms is I don't think we see it as activism per se, right? But how do we use kind of the infrastructure that we have access to in terms of museums or cultural institutions to kind of transform different parts of kind of society or industry, or the economy or culture and so forth. And in that sense, I think it's on the one hand, it's something I think that and I can go just to go back to the example of this piece with salmon and red herring, and when we did it at Tate for the first time, right? When we were invited, I think for us was that because we were working in the sky for quite a few years, and we were asking ourselves, okay, how do we bring all of the work that is happening in Sky, that is this collaboration with restaurants and with schools and with different community groups, and trying to think how you divest the whole island of salmon farming and introducing alternative economies and ecologies and so forth. How do you bring it into this a national institution, and how do you kind of create the links between something that people, this is remote, these kind of questions are not relevant to us here in the city, or we come to the museum to look, and to learn on kind of these phenomena that are happening far away from here. And I think one of the things that became, I think we decided quite early, that is the work is going to be to remove salmon off the menu, from Tate, right? And to do it in a way that it's a commitment in perpetuity from the museum, and to use kind of the fact that it's kind of the national museum, etc., to make that statement. And I think then also we had a big conversation, do we need to do anything else? Maybe we just do that and we leave the gallery empty, and this is the action. And in a way, I think it's something we still that kind of, and we decided to make an installation, because I think for us also having the visual, the color hook in a way, to be able to bring people into it from another perspective was also very important, because it's, I think especially not that it doesn't become a conceptual work in a sense, right? But the fact that it's it's an infrastructural kind of transformation that happens in the museum, and it's not just about art. And I think this is perhaps where, we become more activist, in the sense that we're kind of really kind of thinking what are, where there are holes in the system that we can enter, and kind of, where are the leakages that we can kind of find our way in, and kind of, or use our kind of the fact that we have we are artists, and some people can tend to listen to us, maybe because they don't understand exactly what we mean or like what we want, or there's a certain kind of allure, you know, of like cultural practitioners that we carry that like gives us like, you know, like a certain, opens the door in some instances. And I think this is kind of a lot of kind of what the practice kind of thinks about or kind of tries to work with.
And maybe sorry.
No, you speak, please.
I was going to say, also connecting it back to the dams, where you were saying a couple of things. One is this idea that you mentioned about land art, that also we've been thinking a lot about, because we admire a lot the whole kind of history of land art and the engagement with the landscape. It was quite incredible pieces back in the 60s, 70s, etc., especially in the US context. And then we started questioning ourselves, like, what is the land art of the 21st century? Like, how do we like make another take, or how do we see also these interactions with the landscape not as these incredibly spectacular moves, sometimes very ephemeral, but actually how do we deal with the removal of many of these infrastructures? How do we start kind of erasing some of these also very violent pieces of concrete that are dotting the landscape? And then when we started also talking to different people, many people that have been working on this for decades, especially in Sweden, but in Scandinavia at large, to remove, and also in the US, there are many cases, but we're not that familiar with them, that people have been fighting and working very hard to actually start knocking down some of these dams. And with one in particular, also, he was telling us he's been fighting for like 20 years almost to remove the last barrier of a river that is blocking the entire salmon run. And probably it's not because of us that things have happened, but the fact that we are bringing visibility to those actions in a quite relevant museum within the Swedish context may or may have not kind of sped up that process or triggered something, we don't know. But at least we know that in the public opinion, this is now being debated, especially in such a moment with the energy crisis, to start proposing to remove hydropower dams. It's something to be like thought about.
Yeah, that was such amazing answers from both of you. I guess this idea of you know, this movement, as you described, from land art, where you put something into the landscape and make it into a spectacle, to this new conception where thinking of the removal and the absence and the taking out and the erasure of something as a piece of art is really beautiful. And it's really what the environment needs, not like adding more human kind of input. And I think it's really generous to have the gallery as a space. I can see the thinking that leads to this idea that maybe the gallery should be empty, but the color hook, as you put it, and this idea of, if you're finding a new language, if you're taking something out the landscape and you're asking it to be kind of like this sort of removal of the kind of human input, then to find a way of speaking about that in the gallery through a visual register and this linguistic register, which is really beautiful. And those who read the Red Herring book or listen to the audio, it's really poetic, and it's just another way beyond the visual color that you use language and play with language and the puns and the humor that really draws people in. It's time for questions. So I know that people have been putting questions in the chat, and if people have questions that they want to jump in and ask Daniel and Alon, I think this is the time. Would you like me to read questions, or how does this bit work?
Yeah, thank you so much, Izabella and Alon and Daniel. It's been such an engaging and super interesting conversation. We do have a bunch of questions in the chat. Our first question will be from our friend GE. GE, you should be able to unmute now.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Thank you for this panel, for this amazing and far-ranging, in many ways, discussion. You know, I was first thinking of the first time that I think the word salmon as a color starts to show up in our lexicon is like around 1776, the beginning of our country here in the United States, which is another metaphor in itself. Thomas Jefferson uses it several times in his writings. And I was wondering, because again, the idea of language and color and things like that, isn't the history of pigments kind of a history of control and power, from this genetic control of these species to even the crypto control of the release of Pantone colors?
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And I think this kind of line of thinking is very much indebted to the work of Esther Leslie, that is a professor of aesthetics at Birkbeck University in London, and she wrote this incredible book that is called Synthetic Worlds, that basically kind of traces the emergence of synthetic or kind of industrial kind of colors. And she talks about this idea that like color is something that is futile, it's fading, right? It kind of appears and disappears, and everyone that like works with color from like an industrial perspective, from an artistic perspective, also in the museum from a conservation perspective, right? It's all about trying to preserve color, to kind of fixate it, to make it something that like will last. But color is kind of constantly like running away. And she kind of traces in this book basically the emergence of like the synthetic color industry in Germany in the like mid 19th century, and how that kind of grows to, to become like the industry that kind of during the Nazi regime kind of produces like the Cyclone Bay, because they have like all of this expertise of like trying to like hold kind of molecules and chemicals together. And so yes, like it's very much like 100% is very much the history. And there's this like incredible image that she talks about, basically how in the kind of process of industrialization of color, how it happens is that coal tar is a residue that kind of emerges from the coal industry, and basically scientists are like drowning in this like material that the industry is like trying to think, okay, like how can we monetize on it? And they start kind of mixing it with all kinds of alcohols, and basically at one moment, like one of the scientists kind of puts a drop of alcohol, and kind of all of the colors, of like the rainbow, like appear out of like the darkness of the coal, right? And this is kind of the fact that like all of the colors that we see today are kind of extracted, right, from like the belly, like literally from like the belly of the earth, is something that is, I think for us was like a very important part of like the whole research.
Which in a way also coincides when some of the European powers were seeing that they couldn't rely on the colonies anymore. So they had to extract, Germany in particular, they had to extract, instead of having indigo from plantations in India or other parts of the world, they began to synthesize it in the lab.
Astounding. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, GE. That was such a great question. We also have a question from Lynn Crawford. Lynn, you should be able to unmute now.
Thank you. What a brilliant presentation. And I agree, GE, that was a great question. There are many detailed profiles of the various forms of human crime and harm and pathology, and not only the variety of forms of violence inflicted on humans, but profiles of people who perform one as opposed to the other. And I've always wondered, is there any such development or research when it comes to human and non-human lives and pathology?
I'm sure there is. I can't now kind of mention any in particular, but for us, I think more also thinking about human and non-human, but beyond, quite following perhaps Elizabeth Povinelli's kind of way of thinking about also life and non-life. So yes, we have like humans and non-humans, life and non-life, even including rocks, right? Like for her, it's like rocks, they're obviously non-human, but more than that, they're like forms of non-life in theory, and yet they are also evolving over 1 million years. So yes, we haven't kind of work directly on perhaps the pathogens connected to that, but
I
more
mean,
pollution. I don't know if that's what you were asking for.
no, I was wondering even if the pathology of not looking at these things as lives, or as looking in the way a criminal might look as at another human as an object. They can do anything, you know, they can assault or batter or whatever, a certain type of criminal.
Yeah.
There's a profile for that, and there's different profiles. And with all the climate change, because of human violence toward Earth and disrespect, which you've brilliantly outlined here, I'm wondering if you're aware of any type of psychological profiling of human mistreatment of rocks or of sea or of salmons or of our world, as opposed to a more respectful connection to it. And I'm just wondering if there's any work that you know of in that area.
It's a really good question, and like nothing. I mean, I think there's the. I don't know if this answers like directly, let's say, but like I think there's like a growing kind of work that's being done on the idea of ecocides, and basically how there's kind of crimes that are being kind of inflicted on the environment, and how like ecocide should be something that could be taken kind of to the, you know, like International Criminal Court and things like that. So like in that, and I think there's very much perhaps in line, right? There's like all of the work that has been done in the past decades that started like in Ecuador and in Peru with this idea of like granting rights to nature and kind of basically allowing, and then this was like also in the US with Lake Erie that was granted like rights a few years ago, and there are like a few more examples all over the world. I think that maybe is kind of started, we could see this kind of idea of like how we are kind of can hold like different people accountable in a sense, but like, yeah, I don't know if it's like I have an example that is like you know, like that is looked on kind of from a pure kind of pathological criminal, like from a criminological kind of standpoint or a kind of view, but it's just something we're not like super familiar with.
Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that great question, Lynn. And thank you, Alon and Daniel. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Chloe now for another question.
Hi, Alon and Daniel. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation and conversation with Izabella. My question is about narrative. Salmon a Red Herring almost unfolds theatrically in the space and unfolds with this kind of dark narrative. And you've talked about using color to tell that narrative, but I'm wondering if you can speak to the precision of the storytelling in your practice, because I think it's so unique and impactful, especially when speaking about something like the food ecosystem and how it's so intertwined. And, you know, I think it can be easy to think about everything in the silo, and the work really gets you to think not in that way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think, no, it's a really good question. And I think it's something I'll try to answer it. I wish there'll be like one, like a literary, like like look at it and perhaps like understand this from that perspective as well. I think, and maybe to talk about through a reflection, you know, I think someone once in a conversation, someone like told us, you know, said that like all our work is kind of built on anecdotes. And then that's like in the first moment I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? Like, is that kind of, because it made it, you know, it sounded as like everything, I took it as like something that's like very fragmented, you know, where it's kind of, we're putting all of these like things, but I think,
or shallow.
Yeah, but I think what, like, thinking more and more about that kind of comment, I think there's something that we try to, again, is this idea of the hook, or like, how do we find these kind of moments, you know, these stories that enable to kind of open up all of these kind of other moments, or kind of link together all of these like pieces in this like massive like puzzle or like web of interactions. And I think this is a lot about the way we kind of develop these narratives. Is like we work for like many months, I mean like years, like developing this like research, and then it's like really, you know, the story, like the sparrow suddenly becomes this kind of vehicle, you know, like and it's like Gabriel Hecht talks about this idea of like the interscalar vehicle really beautifully, right? It's this kind of objects or kind of a compound or like a molecule or whatever it may be that kind of takes you, you know, like you can be sitting in it or looking through it and kind of be transported like through all of these like geography scale, you know, from like the micro to like the planetary and like anything in between. And it's, I think that is kind of very much at least what we attempt to do, like to do, because it's like we really, this is how our body, like our bodies are moving through all of these like different substances and all of these scales all the time. And it's like, but we're not capable to kind of fathom or kind of, you know, like understand that. And like, how do we kind of almost create these kind of vantage points, you know, or like these kind of glasses that like will enable us to see the world that we're actually living, you know? And it's, I think we always say it's like we don't read a lot of fiction like ourselves, like we read much more like nonfiction, because it's like it feels that like everything, you know, like all of these stories, there's all of these like crazy stories that already exist like all around us, right? They just need to be like put together. It's like you don't need to kind of, in a way, I think for us, kind of invent a story like from, you know, like with the practice that we do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And I just have one more question for you both. I'm really interested in the process of kind of weaving science and art. And I was wondering how that kind of came for you. And like, was it challenging? Was it easy? Just kind of how you work with both of those forces together in your work.
Yeah, well, it's something we ask ourselves a lot. So how do we, not because we just want to interact with scientific world, but I think it's out of curiosity, perhaps, when we came across the story again of the sparrow. It's like, what? And then you said, how is that possible? And then you try to go to the people that might help you understand that is like incomprehensible at the beginning. And then you go and talk to like someone that researches fish, then someone that researches genetics, and slowly they send you like, no, you have to talk to this person, you have to talk to that person. Then you read a book, and that slowly, I think, is a very organic process for us, that we go and find the expert that can answer questions that we might have. And that might be a farmer, or that might be, I don't know, an engineer, doesn't matter. And there's when all these disciplines are thrown into the mix very organically, I would say. And but I think sometimes I think it's more like changing the perspective in a way. And maybe that's perhaps part of that narrative tactic. For instance, with Hannah Landecker, that she's a professor of society and genetics, when she all of a sudden reversed the logic of like, no, it's not that pollutants are going through us, we are going through pollutants. And that's kind of all of a sudden it's kind of reorders your entire world and how you see toxicity around you, how you see basically the like your own skin dissolving because it's not a boundary anymore. And that's just a matter of reading the world in or upside down or inside out. And those moments sometimes have come from scientists when they just tell you how they actually see their objects of study.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been a really wonderful conversation. Everyone should try to get upstate and head up to Bard and try to see the show. It's going to be really great. I'm really excited to see it. And we do have a tradition here at the Rail of ending with a poetry reading. Thank you again to Alon and Daniel and Izabella for this really wonderful conversation. And I'm really excited to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Britt. Britt currently lives in the Hudson Valley and cooks at Rosie's. Thank you so much for being here, Britt. You should be able to take it away. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for having me and for being here. And yeah, there's a lot to think about. I feel like I learned a lot in that talk. So thank you. And I have 3 poems. So I'll just start. Okay. Newburgh. No matter how far I drive, there are still visions of the West. The way B from the Imperial Valley talks about the sky, telling me I'm a desert kid. The days were 130 degrees, and all my siblings took turns holding a hose over our heads. I remember asking you to stop at the gas station past San Bernardino so I could hug a bag of ice in the car while we drove without air conditioning in the middle of July. Trying to get out of the house to play soccer at People's Park before sunset, we keep stopping to chat or gather things like beer and a chunk of ice thrown into a rice bag, a speaker to play corridos. How do you listen to music that's so sad? Did you listen to it when you were just a tiny grain of sand? When your grandma was outside drinking tequila and your dad singing a cappella? I remember the clamp light shone on our faces while the Yucca Valley sky cast billions of diamonds to send a message I couldn't understand. Then, imagine if we could swim in the Hudson. We can barely see the ball we kick across the grass. Smells like dog shit. The game ends when we can't stand up anymore. Out of breath, S says, I don't want Reese to go away. And B hears, I don't want Luis to go away, wondering out loud, who is Luis? Later in a story about 4 people who are separately cute together, broke up, and today are all friends together. I remember at the park when S said, breaks are good, and J asked, all breaks? And S said, yeah. It gives me hope that the desert used to be an ocean, and it could be again someday. Bon voyage, Sailor Moon. A Sharpie can get caught on an egg carton. These things too happen. There is no life with love. I am loved. I'm not going to kiss their dicks for $12 an hour. I used to want things. Now I have become a sandwich. I don't love. There is no life with love. We can try meeting in our dreams. A remote connection is better for that. Okay. Men. The carpenter eats for free because of all the carpenter work he does for free. His husband's name is Peter, and you're the owner of the restaurant. Your name is Jim. Jim, you are the kind of person I think everyone has a crush on. And even when I don't want to like you, I want to make you happy. Happy. I met the guy who works at the Indian food truck. His name is Max. I think he likes me, but I just need a friend to drink beer with after work. Work. Driving on the 199, I pass a house with a Christmas light negligee in the shape of an American flag. There is a way to wait for something that causes less pain. As far as I know, the way is not fun. Fun. I can hear people shouting with delight, and in my mind, I see the tunnels of the 110 as long as I live. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Britt. That was really, really beautiful. And thank you one more time, Daniel, Alon, and Izabella, for all of your work to make today possible. And again, go see the show, everyone. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for supporting and sponsoring our NSE program, making these daily conversations possible, and for their support on our growing archive, which you can view on our YouTube channel, and this video will be posted shortly. And for the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has been a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events. So please check the chat for a link to donate and support all of our writers and editors and the operations here at the Rail. And please join us tomorrow if you're free at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Shazad Dawood and Charlotte Kent on the event of HMS Alice Liddell at Pancras Railway Station in London, keeping it in the UK to end the week today. And we're going to conclude tomorrow with a poetry reading by Ty Little. Thanks to all of you for joining today, and you should be able to unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Everybody.
Conversation.
Thanks, Izabella.
Thank you so much. Go
Brett.
see the show next weekend.
Thank you.
Everyone,
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.